So I won't read through the bios, and I will turn it over to Sara and Melanie. I don't know if you were going to do it in this order, but I'll just turn the presentation over to you guys, and I will stop sharing, and you can pick up and share your screen, whoever is going to share their screen.
Okay, so yeah, this is Melanie. I'm going to kick it off, and then Sara's going to chime in as needed. So we were going to focus on, you know, if you were an owner of a small business and you wanted to purchase an engine, here's some of the things that you would want to think about as you're deciding what type of engine to purchase. And then after this table here, we have just some of the sort of frequently asked questions or frequent topics that come up. So this shows you what would apply depending on what type of engine you choose. So if you wanted to buy an older engine, which that would be something that had originally been installed, even if it was not at your facility at the time or your business at the time, if it was originally installed before June 12th of 2006, if it had not been reconstructed, which we define as you replace enough components such that the cost of the new components exceeds 50% of the cost of a comparable entirely new engine, and then there's some other conditions, but the main trigger is that 50%. If you bought a smaller compression ignition diesel engine or a spark ignition engine, then all you would have would be management practices. So it's change the oil every certain number of hours, operate and maintain it per the manufacturer's instructions, keep records of maintenance. So, it wouldn't be, I think, very burdensome if that was the avenue that you took. If you elected to go with a larger compression ignition engine that was above 300 horsepower, then that engine would have a numeric emission limit for CO, and the engine would likely need to be retrofit with an oxidation catalyst to meet that limit. You'd have to use ultra-low sulfur diesel and have crankcase controls. You have to do performance testing. It would be just a one-time test if it was 300 to 500 horsepower, and then it would be there'd be ongoing testing if you were above 500 horsepower. You'd have to continuously monitor your catalyst inlet temperature and do monthly checks of your pressure drop, semi-annual compliance reports, and send in some notifications and record keeping. So you'd have a lot more in terms of a compliance burden and a cost burden if that was the type of engine that you chose, because you'd have the cost of the retrofit, the cost of the monitoring, the cost of the testing, the cost of the ongoing reporting. If your engine is, if you decided to go with a reconstructed engine, if the cost of the new components is more than 50% of the cost of a comparable entirely new engine, but if it's less than 75%, then if it's compression ignition, then the engine is going to have to meet the Tier 1 emission standards. If it's greater than 75%, then it has to meet the tier standards for the model year in which the reconstruction occurred. So if you reconstructed it this year, it's going to have to meet, if it's a non-emergency engine, the Tier 4 emission standard. So that would be, something else to keep in mind, because if it's, the difference between having to meet Tier 1 and Tier 4 is Tier 4, you're probably going to have to equip that engine with emission controls such as a particulate filter or SCR in order to meet those Tier 4 standards. In both cases, you have to use ultra-low sulfur diesel. You have to do an initial performance test, and then if it was above 175 horsepower, you'd have an initial notification and records of maintenance. So it wouldn't be quite as burdensome as for the not reconstructed larger size engine, because you wouldn't have the continuous parameter monitoring and you wouldn't necessarily have ongoing testing, but there is going to be some cost associated with that. If it's a spark ignition engine, there would be NOx, CO, and VOC emission standards that it would be subject to. And there again, the stringency of those standards would depend on if you were between that 50 and 75 or you were above 75. What kind of the philosophy we had is if you're above 75%, then you're essentially making a brand new engine. And so we make the engine have to meet the standards for a brand new engine. And then again, you'd have some performance testing and some notifications and record keeping. So that's if you had an older engine. If you decided to buy a new engine, if it's compression ignition, those would be certified by the engine manufacturer to meet the applicable emission standards. And the emission controls would be, if they're necessary, they would, to meet the emission standard, they would come with the engine. So, you know, the cost of those emission controls would be included in the cost of the engine. And then there's no testing or ongoing monitoring required. You just need to install, configure, operate, and maintain the engine per the manufacturer's instructions. If it's spark ignition, if it's less than 25 horsepower, or if it's above 25 horsepower and it's gasoline or rich burn LPG, then engine manufacturers are required to certify those engines to the applicable standards. And so again, what you need to do there is install, configure, operate, and maintain it per the manufacturer's instructions, and you wouldn't have any testing or monitoring requirements. If it's not one of those engines that's certified by the manufacturer, then there are NOx, CO, and VOC emission standards that the engine has to meet, and the burden is on you, the owner-operator, if the engine is not certified, to demonstrate through the means of a performance test that the engine meets those emission standards. If it's a lean burn engine, then there probably wouldn't be any add-on controls necessary to meet those standards. If it's a rich burn engine, it probably would need to have a three-way catalyst or NSCR to meet those emission standards. I think a lot of those engines probably come with those controls already from the manufacturer. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions about this comparison.
This is Sara. I think there was a question in the chat, Melanie. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh, okay. So the question is, how can a small business or engine technician demonstrate the percentage that the engine was reconstructed? Sara, do you want to talk about the way that we typically, that's typically documented?
Sure. So typically, the job is basically on the facility that has the unit to demonstrate that, and there's a variety of ways that you can do that, but most of the time people will submit sort of like a spreadsheet that kind of shows what they would expect the cost of a brand new engine to be, and then you know, then show exactly what was done in their reconstruction process and when they did it, that kind of compares those two, trying to get as much apples to apples as possible to show that, you know, here's what a new facility or a new engine would have, here are the components that we replaced on our engine, and then you sort of total up the dollars in the numerator and the denominator and see which, you know, what that divides out to be, what percentage you end up with, depending on which pieces you replaced and how much they cost.
I'll add that, I think I mentioned this, but the cost is not the only factor. I think there's also some language that says, you know, it's technically feasible to meet the emission standards or something like that. This is all in the general provisions, Subpart A of Part 60. If anyone wants to take a look at the language about reconstruction.
So if someone does a reconstruction of an engine and it does, we were talking about technically feasible, and it does meet these levels of 50 to 75% or greater of the cost of a new unit, is it generally performance testing that's done by the source that proves whether or not the reconstructed engine can meet those new emission standards, or does the manufacturer or whoever rebuilt the engine do that, like in a test cell type situation?
So this is Sara. I mean, it does kind of depend. I mean, I think typically it's performance testing at the facility where the engine has been reconstructed, but we have had situations where manufacturers have, in effect, like recertified the engine, like by adding, you know, controls or something and rebuilding parts of it and then gone through a process similar to the original certification. It's not common, but I know that it has happened. And in that case, I think Melanie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've generally said that if the manufacturer has provided enough information to show that what they've done is equivalent to what they would have done in certifying a brand new engine, you know, we've kind of taken that to be a demonstration of the compliance of that reconstructed engine.
Thank you.
So if nobody else has any questions, we can move on to the next page, which is some of the other topics. So one of the things that Mark asked about was the cost of emission controls. And I actually have a couple of memos that we wrote that I can send around that we did it sort of as a function of the horsepower. So you can, you know, take the horsepower of the engine and put it in an equation, and then that will give you the estimated cost of the emission controls. So, you know, it's in the range of, you know, for a smaller engine, thousands to low tens of thousands. You know, the bigger the engine, the more expensive. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars. You know, for retrofitting the emission controls, and you know, a lot of you know, and it varies, of course, depending on, you know, where the engine is. If it's just sort of sitting out in back of your building versus if it's on the, you know, the top of a skyscraper in New York City, you know, it's going to make a difference in terms of the insulation. I often hear from the manufacturers it's not necessarily, you know, the cost of the equipment itself, but a lot of it is in the installation in terms of what the costs come in. But I can send around those memos, and that will give you more information about the cost of emission control. Another question that someone had was about what's a stationary engine versus what is a mobile engine. And we use the term, well, we use the term mobile engines, and then within mobile we have on-road, which is, you know, cars, trucks, and then we have what we call non-road engines, and that would be, you know, your bulldozers, your lawnmowers, things like that. So, and we give three types of quote unquote non-road engines, and that the first two are those that are used in a piece of equipment that is self-propelled or intended to be propelled while performing its function. Those kinds of engines they're always going to be mobile engines, even if they never move around. If you parked your lawnmower in your garage for 2 years and never mowed your grass, then that's still going to be considered a mobile engine. It's the third category where, you know, we tend to run into a lot of questions, and that's engines that are used in a piece of equipment that's portable or transportable, meaning designed to be capable of being carried or moved from one location to another. So, in some examples that we give of, you know, what it means to be designed to be capable of being carried, or, you know, the engine is on wheels. It's on a skid, it's got a handle, it's on a trailer. Those engines are considered to be non-road mobile engines unless they remain at the same location for more than 12 months or for the full annual operating period of a seasonal source. A seasonal source might be like a quarry in Maine that, you know, is only operating for 8 months out of the year because of the weather conditions. So, so we get sometimes we run into a lot of questions about, okay, what is quote unquote remaining at the same location? We define location as any single site at a building, structure, facility, or installation. So, you know, you can't have an engine that moves around within one location that would be considered a stationary engine. So unfortunately, because of the way the regulatory language is written, it kind of a lot of times comes down to a case-by-case determination. And we have issued a few applicability determinations, which you can find in our ADI and also on our RICE website. about the station, what's stationary versus mobile. And what, the couple of cases that we had, we had engines that were regularly moved all around a facility. I think one was like a mine or something like that. And so, because those engines were regularly moved and didn't remain at one quote unquote location at that facility, we determined that those engines were mobile engines. Now we had another example. It was at a shipyard in Virginia, and there were some engines that were remaining within one dry dock at that shipyard. And so because those engines never left that one location at that facility, even though they did, move around the dry dock periodically, we determined in that case, at least initially, that those engines were stationary engines. Now, the facility came back to us and said, well, we've got some additional information. So, and they never really followed up on that. So, they seem to still have some questions in their mind anyway, but so it was never really a settled matter. But our, initial determination on that facility was that those engines were mobile. And one thing to be aware of is that if you do have an engine that remains at that one location for more than 12 months, then we consider it to be a stationary engine from the first day it started remaining at that location, not from, day 366. So, a facility should be aware that if they're going to keep that engine at that one location, they need to be, and it's going to stay there for more than 12 months, then it should be compliant with any applicable stationary engine requirements, from day one. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. I'll fix that again.
This is Sara. I would just also add to that. We've also had questions where people have tried to swap out engines at the location that are performing basically the exact same purpose and use that as a way to say that it was not a stationary engine because they used a different engine, and that has also generally been determined not to be the case. So even if you change to a different engine with a different serial number, if it's at the same location performing the same function, we would consider both of those engines to be stationary.
And the basis for all of that is the definition of non-road engine in Part 1068, and it does say, as Sara mentioned, that an engine that replaces an engine and performs the same or similar functions is included in counting the consecutive time period.
Are there a lot of issues, or have you been aware of any interpretation issues involving the storage of an engine? Maybe it's like an engine that's used for maintenance purposes of some type, and so it's not used very often, and it's just like sits in the warehouse or the maintenance shop for a long period of time until it needs to be used again. Have you ran into how that's defined? Thank you.
We did do an applicability determination that was kind of similar. It was that kind of situation where they were keeping it stored, for long periods of time. But when it was used as a mobile engine, and so we said, that it would be considered a mobile engine, even if it stayed in the shed for more than 12 months. If it was, as long as it wasn't being used for any purpose while it was in that shed. And I think in this example where we did a determination, which, you can find at that link that I provided there, they actually did even take it out of the shed every once in a while and start it up just to make sure it would still function. But even then we said, we'd still consider it to be a mobile engine.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions about that, I'll move on to the next bullet. Someone indicated that there was maybe still some confusion about the residential, institutional, and commercial exemption provision. So this is only in the NESHAP regulation. It's not relevant for the NSPS. And it's only for existing emergency engines at area sources of HAP that aren't operating for the 50 hours that's allowed for emergency engines to operate to mitigate local transmission and distribution limitations. So if you have an engine that doesn't meet that criteria, then this exemption would not apply, and it certainly wouldn't apply for anything that's subject to the NSPS. And if anyone has a question about what's a residential, institutional, or commercial facility, we do have a memo on our website that lists all the NAICS codes and says whether we consider those to be residential, institutional, or commercial. So if there are no questions, the next item, there was also, I was told there's some confusion about limited use engines. Again, this is something that's only relevant in the NESHAP. It's not used in the NSPS. For engines that are greater than 500 horsepower at major sources of HAP, if you have a limited use engine, which we define as used less than 100 hours per year, then there's no requirements other than an initial notification if it's a new engine. If it's an existing engine, there's just no requirement. For engines less than or equal to 500 horsepower at major sources of HAP and any size of area sources, being a limited use engine doesn't give you a break in terms of what emission standard you have to meet. The only thing it gives you a break is in the testing and reporting requirements. They have less frequent testing every 5 years instead of every 3 years. And for reporting, I think it's maybe annually instead of semi-annually. And there was a question about what happens if the engine exceeds the 100 hours before 5 years are up? Then, we would, I think our guidance is that they need to be doing the testing every 3 years then, and if they're in year 4 and they exceed the 100 hours, then, I think they're exceeded the requirements in the rule. So if they think they're going to go over 100 hours, before the 5 years is up, then they shouldn't be considered a limited use engine in terms of the testing and reporting frequency. And I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything else you want to add there.
I think just so everybody's clear, when you're talking about the 100 hours, that's 100 hours in each of the 5 years, not 100 hours for the total 5 years, correct?
That's right. Yeah, each calendar year.
So it's like in one of those 5 years, they happen to exceed the 100 hours in that annual period, then they would potentially, if it's been more than 3 years since they had their last test, they could potentially be in violation of that requirement because they would no longer be considered a limited use engine. So they would need to be thinking about that if they were concerned that at some point in the next 5 years they might need to go over that 100 hours. Now I think if it had only been a year or two since their last test, they probably could just do their testing that year, right? Potentially.
So they wouldn't get like let's say it's year 3.5 or whatever. So they've gone past the 3-year mark and they operate over 100 hours with an engine. They wouldn't get like a 180-day window to get their performance testing done to get into compliance, or would it be just non-compliance? And
I mean, they would need to talk to the delegated authority for wherever they are, state or EPA region, if the state hasn't taken delegation of the rule. But typically when somebody is changing a subcategory like that, where it's something that they should know how many hours they've been running, right? So they should know if they're getting close to their 100. They would not usually have, it's certainly not given in the rule anywhere that if you go over your 100 hours, usually you have to be in compliance upon the moment that you become some other subcategory. It's kind of similar to when you're in, if you thought you were going to be an emergency engine and then you end up going over the number of hours that you're allotted for emergency engine operation. for non-emergency operation as an emergency engine, at that point you're a non-emergency engine and you need to be in compliance with the non-emergency requirements immediately, basically. So I think it would be similar for the limited use.
Okay, thank you.
But again, you'd want to talk to your delegated authority, because depending on the circumstances, you know, depending on why you went over, there may be, you know, discretion that they could provide.
Thank you.
Because, yeah, I mean, I think it is true that in some cases where, you know, you switch status, like, for example, for an emergency engine, we have said that you have 180 days. You know, we have said, like, that's sort of your compliance date, and you have 180 days to do the stack testing. So we have given that guidance before.
Well, I mean, like I said, you're considered to be subject to that subcategory the minute that the definition applies to you. But yeah, it's possible that you could have some time to get into compliance.
But you need to be compliant with the emission limits at the moment you do the switch. And if you did the testing 60 days later and you weren't meeting the standards, you'd have been out of compliance for that whole 60 days.
Right.
Thank you.
Back to residential, institutional, and commercial exemption, the area sources in a NESHAP that have emergency engines, I'm guessing, must meet the definition that's in the NESHAP as to what's an emergency engine?
You mean in order to get that exemption?
Right. So I think that's kind of why it seems like, in a way, they're subject to the NESHAP, in a way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is true that they would have to limit their hours of operation, you know, as specified in the NESHAP in order to be considered an emergency engine.
So we probably would still recommend that they record or keep some kind of documentation that can prove that. Otherwise, like you said, they're totally exempt from the rest of the NESHAP then.
Yeah, typically we would say that, you know, sort of the onus is on them to demonstrate that they meet the definition for that subcategory.
Okay.
In order to show that the exemption applies to them. So, I mean, they would only be able to avail themselves of the exemption if they can show us that they meet the definition. And so whatever they would need to have to show us that.
Thank you.
So the next item, and this has to be probably the item that I've gotten the most questions about in my time here at the EPA related to the rice rules, is the quote-unquote gap or donut hole. And so what happens, subpart, the NESHAP specifies that if you're a new engine less than 500 horsepower at a major source, or a new engine any size at an area source, all you need to do to comply with the NESHAP is comply with the NSPS. And new means construction commenced after June 12th of 2006. But if you go to the NSPS regulations, you know, the dates don't exactly match up with the NESHAP. So you can have an engine that was constructed, as we define that term in the NESHAP, after June 12th of 2006, but it was ordered and or manufactured prior to the applicability dates that are specified in the NSPS regulations. And particularly with the spark ignition engine, NSPS, because there is, you know, the applicability date for that rule can be as late as January 1, 2009, depending on what type of engine it is. So, I mean, I used to get this question probably once a week, you know, as to what happens in that case. And so, you know, what we've said is the engine is technically subject to the NESHAP regulation, but there are no requirements that the engine has to meet, and it's not subject to any requirements under the new source performance standards because it was manufactured prior to the applicability dates in the NSPS. And we did put this as one of our Q's and A's in our Q&A document, so I'll put a link there because that's what I generally, we just have kind of one example scenario in the Q&A, but you know, that's what I generally point people to. Any questions about the donut hole? Okay, so the next, someone asked, you know, what guidance should be given for a facility that, you know, is past due on reports? Maybe they just, you know, determined after the fact that they were subject to the rule and should have been reporting. Should they just send them in? Should they be paper or electronic? Sara, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, again, unfortunately, the answer is probably the best course of action is for them to get in contact with their delegated authority as soon as possible, because depending on if it's the state or the EPA regional office, the process may be different. And if they are past due reports, so not, sometimes people are even, you know, years or whatever overdue, the process for submitting the reports may be different depending on, you know, how old they are. So like, you know, the state or the region may have an electronic way of submitting reports that are sort of current, but their system may not be able to handle reports that are past due. So I think, you know, so the best course of action is for them to just get in contact with their delegated authority as soon as possible and explain their situation and explain what, you know, what they believe they need to submit, and just have that conversation with them.
And we do have a list on our website of all the regional office RICE contacts, so you could refer people to them. And also on the paper electronic, I was going to say, for in purposes of the EPA regulations, the only thing that's required to be submitted electronically in those regulations is the annual report that's required for emergency engines that are participating in a financial arrangement and operating for 50 hours for local transmission and distribution limitations. But that's not to say that, you know, state and EPA regional offices may have their own system that they want you to follow. So like Sara said, you should definitely follow up to make sure that they don't have some kind of electronic submittal process. Okay. So if there are no questions about that, so the next topic that was asked about was waivers for stack testing. We have granted those in a few cases where a facility was testing identical engines, same make and model, same manufacture date, and similar hours of operation that were at the same facility. There's examples of, you know, our letters granting those waivers in the ADI or on our compilation of letters that's on our website. I've never seen a situation where we granted a waiver that, you know, for two engines that were not at the same facility. There's some guidance in our national stack testing policy about, and it's on pages 8 through 10 in that document that I linked there, about the criteria that we would normally look at in judging whether we would want to waive stack testing for a facility. So, you know, I would encourage you to refer to that. Sara, is there anything else you should want to add?
I just note that in some cases we have not waived it, but we've sort of like increased the time frame. So instead of every engine at the facility needing to be tested every year or something like that, we've, you know, said if you have, you know, 9 engines, you test 3 of them a year and you get all 9 of them done within 3 years or something like that. So it's not always necessarily a complete waiver, like you don't ever have to test this engine, but there's, you know, sometimes some ability to, you know, spread the testing out.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. Okay. So if there's no questions about waivers, one thing Mark and I talked about was certified engines, and, you know, is it guaranteed to be certified forever, or, you know, how does that all work? So generally the engine manufacturer certifies and warranties the engine for, we've used the term both useful life and certified emissions life. And I put here an excerpt of what we said in one of our response to comments document about what happens after the useful life is over. And we basically just said, you know, it's the owner operator's responsibility to ensure that continues to meet the emission standards, and we expect that if you operate and maintain it per the manufacturer's instructions, that it would continue to meet those emission standards. So we don't require any type of testing, you know, that you have to do after that useful life or certified emissions life to show that it continues to meet the emission standard. So, you know, essentially we kind of did a little bit of hand waving at that, you know, on this issue. I don't know if there are any questions. Okay. If not, the last item that I had that was a question was there any kind of funding for engine replacement? The only program I've seen is the DERA grants. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. I think it's Diesel Emission Reductions Act that I've seen, you know, funding given out for stationary engine replacement. I've seen it mainly in Alaska. I don't know. You know, I've only had peripheral involvement with that, so I'm not very familiar with the program and how the money's handed out. But that's really the only, in terms of, you know, nationwide EPA program, that's really the only one that I'm aware of. I don't know if anybody else has had any other experiences that they want to share.
This is Barb from Kansas. I did check on the DERA, whether it would fund engine replacement for municipalities, and they said it would not fund if it was to meet compliance with regulations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
It's more for voluntary programs.
So that's all the topics that we had. I don't know if there's anything else that folks want to talk about. And I see we had a question in the chat of, do we maintain a list of entities which have submitted notifications? We don't on like a nationwide level. Some of our regional offices, I think, maintain lists, but you know, some do, some don't. I know, like Region 1, for example, I think it's pretty good about maintaining that kind of information, but there's other regions that I think don't.
Hi, Melanie and Sara. This is Jeremy Hansen from Pennsylvania. Thank you first for providing the presentation. I wanted to quickly ask, can you provide a copy of this Word document that you have with all the links? Because I'd like to check that out at a later time.
Yeah, definitely. Should I send it to maybe Barb, or who should I send it to, and then you can distribute it?
Probably to Mark Stoddard.
To Mark, okay. Yeah, I'll send that and the memos on the control devices costs that I've mentioned.
Hi,
Okay, thank you.
this is Mark with Indiana, and I didn't know if EPA maintains a list of all the regulated entities that have submitted notifications. So that way, if we're going out to help a facility and they're not on the list, we can kind of advise them appropriately.
Yeah, this is only, we don't on like a headquarters basis. Now, some of our regional offices, I think, maintain, Region 1 does, for example, but I'm not sure about all of the regional offices.
Okay, with that being said, do you know if there's any national or regional initiative as far as engines, in particular in relationship to maybe small businesses that may not have required permits, and they may have gone unknown, and maybe working with maybe regional inspectors to go out and ferret out these locations that perhaps have older engines that should have been tested?
I'm not aware of anything like that. I mean, I think, you know, there was a push, an outreach push when we originally promulgated these rules a few years ago, but I don't think anything's been done recently. Sara, do you know of anything?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, the regions do have, you know, in their enforcement offices, they do have their own, you know, focuses or whatever that they decide to work on in any given year in terms of what kinds of inspections they want to go out and do. But I have not heard of engines being, you know, a particular push in any of the regions, but it's not something that I would necessarily hear about. So I mean, it's certainly possible that one of the regions would have decided, you know, for whatever reason, because they've been getting a lot of complaints, or they've seen these things when they're out in, you know, doing inspections for other purposes, and wanted to make that push, but it's certainly not been a national push at any level.
Do you know, again, for lack of a better description, would there be anything kind of like a top 10 list of, if you're going to violate the either NESHAP or NSPS, you're likely to violate these 10 things more than anything, or based on findings from inspections?
As far as I know, no one has compiled such a list. I mean, sort of anecdotally, you know, Melanie and I get questions from facilities as well as from, you know, states and EPA regions about things that they, you know, have gotten questions on from facilities or have seen when they're out doing inspections. The types of questions that we have gotten, you know, run the gamut, but I don't know that, you know, I don't know that they would be anything more than anecdotal. I don't think anyone has done any sort of, you know, compilation that would give you any sort of real, you know, sort of statistical sense of, are these most prevalent, or are these just the questions that tend to trickle up to where Melanie and I sit. And we certainly get questions a lot about facilities that have engines that the facility considers to be an emergency engine, but, you know, the delegated authority, for whatever reason, may not consider what the use that they're using it for to be truly, you know, emergency. We've definitely gotten questions about a lot of these things that Melanie's just gone through, where we've had unclear or needed clarification within the rule language about how we're interpreting certain terms. And so we've had folks who, you know, maybe misinterpreting the definition of location, misinterpreting the definition of a non-road engine. They think that what they have is a mobile engine, but it's not, you know, that kind of stuff.
Well, I was thinking, like, for example, and again, I never really had questions for remote locations where they might operate an engine with their primary source of power. But I dealt a lot with, or involved with, more the emergency. But I know the use of the non-resettable hour meter as an example. But maybe it would be very uncommon to find any engine used for emergency purposes not to have that non-resettable hour meter. It's just part of the manufacturer's scope of making the engine to include that non-resettable hour meter. Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly got questions when that requirement first was promulgated. We certainly got questions from folks about, you know, does this qualify as a non-resettable hour meter? And they had, you know, special cases or whatever. But again, you know, it was relatively anecdotal. I don't know that that would be something that we could tell you is, yes, that's definitely something you should always look for, because we've had a lot of issues with that. I mean, it was more of we had a few people ask us questions when the requirement first came out to make sure that they were understanding what we meant by it and whether or not what they wanted to have on their engine was good enough.
But no findings from, say, like an inspection, either by EPA or by a state?
I don't know, Melanie, if you've heard of any, but I've not heard of any significant, you know, reports from a state or delegated authority saying we're finding a lot of folks without resettable hour meters, or with ones that we wouldn't consider to be non-resettable. I've not heard that.
Also, the labeling requirements for, I think, the newer engines, how detailed that needs to be, or it just has a reference to, I guess, the NSPS 4I or 4J being an emergency engine, maybe a reference to 40 CFR 60 4I or 4J, or whether it needs to be more detailed.
I mean, there are regulatory provisions that specify what needs to be on the label for a certified engine. I don't remember, you know, I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but it's stipulated what they have to have
Right, and again, I don't know if I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, whether the label, there's some latitude there as far as it does reference an engine, and maybe this CFR, and it's for emergency purposes. Maybe that in of itself is okay. And maybe it was an issue early on, but maybe it's no longer an issue because manufacturers all know what that required verbiage needs to be on those labels.
I mean, it shouldn't be a point of confusion from the manufacturers because it's very explicit in the CFR what they have to include. One of the things that, if it is certified only to the emergency engine standards, it needs to be labeled as such. That is definitely one of the things that's required. I think if it's limited to certain types of fuel, I think, it needs to say that, it should be operated with ultra low sulfur diesel fuel. I mean, there's several things that it needs to include.
And I will note that we haven't heard a lot of problems with certified engines being labeled improperly, but I know Melanie has received a couple of, photos of labels at times, over the course of several years, but one or two where somebody who had an engine that was not actually certified had put some verbiage on the nameplate or something that sort of seemed to imply that it was. They said something like it meets the requirements, but it's not from an engine family that has actually been certified by EPA. So we've had instances where we've had labeling issues, but I'm not aware of, like an instance where a manufacturer had a certified engine that had an improper label attached to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I pulled up the regulation, and I mean it's very specific. It's like for example, for a compression ignition engine, less than 10 liters per cylinder, it's got to have your corporate name, your engine family, power category, displacement, date of manufacturer, emission control system, if it's ultra low sulfur diesel only, useful life. It has to say that it complies with regulations for X model year. So, there's a whole section in the CFR that stipulates what they need to include on that label.
And that's 104A?
The one I was looking at is 1039.135. I mean, I think it's referenced in Subpart I when you go into what are the compliance requirements for if I'm a manufacturer. It says you must meet, whatever requirements in 1039 apply. And yeah, it says you must be labeled according to the provisions in Part 89, 94, 1039, or 1042 as appropriate. And then it specifically says, if it's not meeting the emergency standard, if it's not meeting the non-emergency standards, you need to label it as such. This is in like 60.4210 F, for example.
Do you have anything that comes up with the question that you're going to raise? You had a question earlier from somebody else about how to determine if what adds.
This is Christopher Sissel, IDEM. I had a question that was raised by an inspector earlier. They were wanting to know if there's some way for us to determine if the engine has been certified, like if the source doesn't have that certification.
So there is the certification is all handled by our Office of Transportation and Air Quality, and they do have a website where they post a spreadsheet that lists all the engine families that were certified for each model year. So if the engine family or the make and model of the engine, you can go look on their website and see if there was a certificate issued for that engine.
Okay.
And if it was certified, there should be a label on the engine, as we discussed, and it should have the engine family on that label.
Right. Thank you.
Melanie, besides the RegNav tool and the FAQ document, is there anything specifically geared for small businesses or for area sources, or is that in the works or going to be planned for some future date?
We're not really actively working on anything right now. I mean, there are a couple of, I guess you could call plain language guidance materials that we posted on our website. I think one was for ag engines. They're a few years old now. They should still be correct with the exception of the provisions related to operation of emergency engines for demand response, you know, where that one provision was vacated. And we haven't made any updates since then. But other than that, there's nothing new that we're working on.
Yeah, because Mark and I were talking last week, and again, this is Jeremy Hancher from Pennsylvania. Like one of the things that we're coming across, at least here in Region 3, is, you know, there's like a small area source that's in the middle of nowhere, usually like northern Pennsylvania, have never heard about, you know, the rice NESHAP or anything along those lines. They're in a rural area. They're not anywhere near, you know, a heavy electrical grid or something like that. So they're operating diesel to power all their units and stuff. And then we start getting in a conversation with, hey, these engines may be subject to rice. And then we try to like forward them via email some sort of document to, you know, the rice rule, and it just blows our mind. You're like, what are you talking about? This is in a different language. So I struggle with that myself, as to like, how can I kind of help better educate some of these small businesses and just learning more about this? And I'm struggling with it, I guess. So I don't know if you can offer any pointers as to, is there a specific document, or just continually work with the business and the state in trying to get them to better understand the requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know the document I'm talking about, where we did a summary of the rice NESHAP requirements for area sources. I mean, it's, you know, it's a shorter document. I don't know if something like that would work for you, if we, you know, we maybe went in and updated what has changed, and, you know, if we need to add information about the NSPS as well. I mean, I don't know if something like that is still too much information for them. I don't know if you're familiar with the document I'm talking about. I can send you a link to it.
Yeah, I've probably seen it before. I'm just wondering if there's something specifically for area sources. I'll have to take a second look at it, because I know there's a lot of spreadsheets out there too that kind of summarize all the requirements based upon the date of the engine made and the size of horsepower and stuff. So
yeah,
perhaps if you, I was going to say, perhaps if you could send the link in your document that you could share to the group, that would be
yeah, I can do that.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Hey, Melanie, did we record any webinars when we first issued the rules that might be helpful? Sometimes it's easier for people to watch than to read. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if they're still posted. I mean, and we did those videos for ag engines where, I mean, even though they were done for ag, you know, the same requirements apply regardless of where the engine is located. I mean, the only problem is the information hasn't been updated after the vacature. So if they had an emergency engine, they would need to be aware of the demand response issue. But other than that, I mean, the information is still current.
Yeah, although if we're talking about, you know, engines that are being operated remote for sort of prime power, they're probably not to the grid, so demand response is probably not an issue.
Probably not. So yeah, I mean, we do have those videos that are on the website.
Yeah, I want to thank both Melanie and Sara for their participation, the time they took to prepare, and the actual presentation itself. And taking or going through all the questions and answers, that every one of us who considers ourselves jack of all trades but master of none, and trying to grasp the terminology and try to make certain that we're as educated as possible so that when we get that next call or we visit that next site, we can be as helpful and informative. Thank you very much. And hopefully maybe other people from EPA would be also willing to share their expertise in some specific